A bunch of people have asked me at various points about workflow and when do I do this and how do I use this tool and which tool do I use. And I came across this video a couple of weeks ago by a YouTube channel, View into Space, and it was called The 10 Golden Rules of PixInsight. Essentially, he was trying to explain a workflow using 10 different tools, the order that they should be used in, because PixInsight and Photoshop and other processing software, there typically tend to be many different ways to achieve a similar result. There's many different algorithms for sharpening or noise removal or things like that. But while that's all well and good, you have to execute each of these steps in a certain order because certain scripts or programs require that you have done something before or haven't done something yet in order to get the best results. So what I tried to do is distill this into a PowerPoint that uses the M51 data from Luna 1 and just sort of walks through these steps, how I would go about processing this image, what alternatives there are at each step and why we use each tool when we do. And just keep in mind too that this, Luna 1 is monochrome data. This walkthrough works just fine with one-shot color. So his golden rules, I pulled these right out of his video. First one is applying cosmetic correction. Now he's processing in PixInsight, so some of these terms are PixInsight specific, but the technique isn't PixInsight exclusive. So what cosmetic correction in PixInsight at least is doing is it's correcting your hot and cold pixels as well as your bad columns if your camera happens to have one of those. In PixInsight, it's pretty streamlined. What it'll do is you set thresholds high and low for hot and cold pixel detection, and it's actually baked into now the weighted batch pre-processing script, and it'll basically generate a defect map for your camera in your individual light subs, and it'll go through and it'll scrub them all out. I put a before and after here. Believe me, I did run this. In this particular preview, there just weren't too many bad pixels. I used it on one of my images, and you can see, individual white or black pixels that aren't stars, and it does clean them up. So it's just like I never used it before, but I'm going to start using it now because it does make a difference. So that's the first. So the next thing you want to do is crop your masters. When you stack data, you'll get either a master color image or masters per channel. And if you're dithering or you're shooting over multiple nights, the edges of your images typically will not line up exactly right. So in this case, they definitely didn't line up because halfway through shooting this, I had to take the camera off and then put it back on. So you can see the upper right-hand corner and along the top, it's much less signal to noise than in the lower half. So that's the spot, all the stars are aligned, but you get this sort of real staticky issue around the edge. So what you want to do is crop all of that off so that it doesn't affect your gradient removal or anything further down the line. Plus, it makes the image ultimately look better if you get rid of those jagged edges on it. And again, this is now automated in weighted batch pre-processing. If you check it off, it will automatically detect and auto crop your edges. So step 3 is a biggie. This is gradient removal. This is correcting any issues after calibration that your flats don't take care of. So if you have an uneven light source, whether you're shooting near the moon or light pollution or some other issue that flats didn't take care of, gradient removal will seek to give you an evenly exposed image corner to corner. So in PixInsight, there's a couple methods. There's both auto and dynamic background extraction. Dynamic background extraction can be a little tedious, but it works pretty well. Lately, however, though, I've been using Graxpert, which is a free download, graxpert.com, and it utilizes an AI system which will automatically put the sample points on your image and then remove the background. And I've found since they put this AI mechanism in, this AI function in, the images are ridiculously good after the fact. So show across the bottom, I've got my red master there in the lower left, put it through Graxpert, subtract the gradient. You see that uneven exposure there. And then on the right, it's a much flatter black background, edge to edge. Next, we have color calibration. This has undergone a lot of iterations, especially in PixInsight. It used to be called color calibration, then it was photometric color calibration, and now the one everyone likes is spectrophotometric color calibration, or SPCC. And what you've done at this point is, if you're using a mono camera, you've combined your RGB to get a color image. Believe it or not, this is a color image at the bottom. It's just doesn't have any curves applied to it yet. So it's very muted. And if you're using a one-shot color, you're already going to have a color image. It also requires that your image is still linear, so not stretched, and that the image has been plate solved. You can do this in PixInsight using Image Solver. And it will also require that you have PixInsight pointed to the Gaia SPC database, which is about a 12 gigabyte download. You just have that sitting on your disk somewhere. And basically what it'll do, it will color calibrate your image based on, you can, from drop downs in the SPCC, you can select your camera sensor, and you can select even the exact make of filters that you have. And if this was a narrow band target, you can also set the band pass of all of them, whether they're 3, 5, 7 nanometer, whatever. So it's calibrating the image specifically to the hardware that took the image, and it's based on the scientific star data. It knows what the stars are supposed to look like, and it calibrates accordingly. So it's hard to see in that, but I did it. Finally, there's background neutralization here. Not a ton to say about this. Essentially, you're just grabbing, like I preview one there, a section of clean background. You're pointing background neutralization to that, and you're applying it. And what that's going to do is, if there's any oil slick or any unevenness to your background, it's going to try to flatten that out. Some of these other tools have more impact, I promise. So this one's a biggie. This is a PixInsight exclusive blur exterminator. It is an AI-based sharpening tool exclusive to PixInsight. What it does is it uses the point spread function, which is it measures the X and the Y of your stars, and it compares those to an AI model trained on Hubble data, which is supposed to be perfectly focused, perfectly, optically perfect, because you're not shooting through any atmosphere or anything like that. The optics cost a little more than your telescope. So using AI, it will adjust the point spread function and tighten up your stars, but will also tighten up all the structure in your image, whether it be a galaxy like this or a narrowband target. And the caveat being, it's $100 for a license on top of PixInsight, but I drank the Kool-Aid I've bought in, and I think it's absolutely worth the price of admission. So you can see, especially in the center of this galaxy, it really tightened up all the dust lanes, sharpened them, and reduced bloating on the stars. So it's a really nice tool. In the same vein, then you move on to your noise extermination. Same idea. It's AI based. It protects the structure in your image, and it, as the name implies, reduces noise everywhere else. So you can see this one's pretty dramatic. The noise in the before and the after, you get a nice smooth background, while the galaxy and the stars remain sharp. Alternatives to this, you can use the easy noise reducer script in PixInsight. You can also make a custom mask and use TGV denoise in RGBK mode. Has a similar effect, but it's just easier using the noise exterminator, in my opinion. Yeah, and having a smooth background in your images does make significant aesthetic improvement. All right, star exterminator. Any guesses as to what this does? This will remove your stars, and this is a big deal. When I first started processing, I would process everything as one image with the stars in there, and it just you don't think about the stars too much when you're shooting a big nebula or a galaxy. But I've found that protecting the stars and protecting the color in the stars and how much they may or may not bloat if you stretch things really does make a big impact on a good image. And so what this does is it takes all the guesswork out of it. You basically split the channel into your structure and your stars so that you can process them independently. And later I'll show you how you bring the stars back in. But this one's a really, it seems trivial, but it does make an impact on a good image. Plus it lets you, if you're shooting with filters, bring in RGB stars instead of narrowband stars. Alternatives to this right now, you can use StarNet or StarNet 2, do a similar job. So finally, all of this has been linear. Finally, we are stretching our image. In a linear image, all of our information, if you look at the histogram on the left and the bottom panel, all of the information's crunched up against the black point there. That's all the information in our image because these objects are so faint. We stretch our images to essentially stretch the histogram. That way we can work on it as if it were a traditional non-Astro photo. This can be done a multitude of ways, the tried and true, stretching the histogram, bringing the midpoint over to the black point, applying and then reevaluating until you're happy with it. You can use the screen transfer function and apply that directly to the histogram to get a pretty good initial stretch. The only thing you want to really keep in mind when you're doing this is that know where the black and white points are, and you don't want to clip data or blow out your highlights. I see some people when they're processing an image, they'll just drag the black point up to make their background really dark, and it looks like just an inky pool, and space isn't this inky black color, and you lose detail that way. So be aware of that when you're stretching. So at this point, after you've stretched it, this is where you'd go in and you'd pull up like the curves tool, something like that, and you would pull up your saturation, maybe pull up individual channels, something like that, to do color work. So you'll do the histogram stretch, and then you'll go in and do color work at this point. And it'll do the same thing with your stars. You'll stretch your stars to taste, and then you'll do the color work. So at this point, I've stretched this image and I've done color work on it. So my stretched color stars are in the lower left, and my galaxy, which I've done color work to, is in the upper right. And now I just recombine them. You can do this in PixInsight using pixel math. You can do this in Photoshop if you have them on different layers, just merging the layers together. One thing that's come up recently with Star Exterminator, there's a toggle called Unscreen Stars. And when you re-add the stars, this pixel math expression that I put there on the last line, that is exactly the inverse operation that Star Exterminator uses. So it's putting the stars back exactly in the same manner that they were removed, which helps preserve the color in the stars, as opposed to what I had been doing for quite a while, just taking the starless and adding the stars with just starless plus stars. This I found you retain better color if you do the opposite expression of what Star Exterminator did. So you just do that right in pixel math. So at that point, you got a pretty good looking image. So I just put, these are some of the things that I do when I get to that point. So after you combine the luminance, if you're shooting mono, things I do, I apply TGV denoise to smooth the background. I put an inverted luminance mask on, and then I run TGV denoise in CIE lab mode. And what this will do is it protects all the highlights in your image, and it targets just the background, and it'll smooth any noise that any of your color work or anything like that may have induced. Then I do unsharp mask. So I invert that luminance mask that I've applied. This will protect the background and it will target just the structure. And this is additional sharpening. And I find that this can make a big difference in how your image looks ultimately doing this step. Finally, then there's dark structure enhanced. It's actually under utilities in PixInsight. You don't really have to mess with any of the toggles in this. You just sort of apply it, and at default values, it does a pretty good job. And what this does is it targets any dark nebula in your image, as well as dust lanes and galaxies, and it enhances the contrast in those. So it just makes for a more impactful image. And then like the last little cleanup things I'll do, I'll tweak the black point a bit. Any contrast without clipping the black point makes for a more dramatic image. And I just said there at the bottom, don't clip the blacks, drag it right up to the beginning of your data, but don't cut into your data. And then finally, just save it in some sort of lossless format, like a TIFF. You want to drop it down to 16-bit and make sure you check off the ICC profile, or it's going to look strange if you don't. So then you get, I processed this just following that along last night with the Luna 1 data, and it turns out a pretty good image. So, there's a lot of other stuff you can do in there, but that's, a basic workflow takes probably half an hour and you can crank out a pretty good image with it. That's a workflow I use, and hopefully people who had questions about workflows can use this as a resource.